Your mind is not under your control. Every day you are invaded. Thoughts you did not choose, impulses you did not authorize, narratives you did not write. You call this thinking. It is occupation. You believe your thoughts are yours, that the internal monologue running constantly through your mind represents your authentic self, that the beliefs and desires and judgments arising in consciousness are products of your will and your character. You experience yourself as thinker of your thoughts, as originator of the narratives and evaluations and impulses that fill your mental space. But most of what fills your mind is not yours, is not chosen, is not even actually you thinking. It is invasion of foreign content, cultural programming, ancestral patterns, absorbed beliefs, conditioned responses, social conditioning, advertising messages, algorithmic manipulation, trauma responses, ego defenses. Your mental space is occupied territory, is battlefield where forces you did not invite compete for control of your attention and your behavior and ultimately your life. The spiritual warfare in daily life is not battle between good and evil in metaphysical sense, but is psychological war for sovereignty over your own mind, is struggle to distinguish between thoughts that are genuinely yours and thoughts that have been implanted or conditioned or triggered, is fight to reclaim mental territory from occupying forces that use your consciousness as battleground for their own purposes. You are not fighting demons, you are fighting for basic capacity to think your own thoughts, to choose your own responses, to live according to your own values rather than according to programs running automatically in your mind. Understanding this warfare requires examining not what you think, but what thinks through you, not the content of thoughts, but their origins and purposes. A thought appears. You did not summon it. You do not want it. You cannot stop it. You call this your mind. It is intrusive occupation. The first battleground is the constant stream of thoughts that arise without your invitation or permission. Thoughts you did not choose to have and often actively wish you were not having. Thoughts that hijack your attention and control your emotional state and direct your behavior despite your conscious desire to think differently. These intrusive thoughts are not accidents or malfunctions, but are evidence that your mind is not under your control, that something else is using your consciousness as broadcasting system for content you did not request. The thoughts can be anxious, catastrophizing that loops endlessly despite your attempts to stop it, negative self-talk that undermines your confidence and worth, obsessive rumination about past events or future possibilities, compulsive urges that push you toward behaviors you know are harmful, critical judgments about yourself or others that you do not actually endorse when you examine them. These thoughts arise automatically, repeat compulsively, resist your efforts to dismiss or redirect them, create emotional states and behavioral impulses that feel like they are happening to you rather than coming from you. This automaticity reveals that much of what you experience as thinking is actually psychological programming running without your conscious input or authorization. The programming can be anxiety conditioning from past trauma, can be critical parental voices internalized in childhood, can be cultural messages about worth and success and normalcy, can be ego defense mechanisms protecting you from threats to self-image, can be advertising and media content that has colonized your mental space and now generates desires and comparisons and dissatisfactions that serve corporate interests rather than your well-being. The war begins when you recognize that these thoughts are invasions rather than expressions of your authentic self, that they do not represent your genuine beliefs or desires, but represent programs installed by experiences and cultures and systems that have their own agendas. The recognition is disorienting because you have spent your life believing these thoughts were you, identifying with them completely, assuming that the voice in your head was your voice rather than recognizing it as occupation force speaking through you while you mistake its messages for your own thinking. You hear their voices inside your own head, telling you who to be, what to want. You call this conscience. It is internalized control. The second battleground is the internalized voices of authority figures and social systems that continue to operate in your mind long after you have left their direct influence. Voices that judge and criticize and direct and control your behavior, not through external force, but through having colonized your internal world so thoroughly that you experience their control as your own thoughts and values. These voices are not memories of what others said, but are active programs that continue generating content, continue evaluating your choices, continue enforcing norms and expectations that you may not even consciously endorse. The parental voice that tells you you are not good enough, the The cultural voice that tells you what success requires, the religious voice that generates guilt for desires and thoughts, the social voice that enforces conformity through shame and anxiety, the consumerist voice that generates constant dissatisfaction and desire for more. These voices speak with your internal voice, arise in your consciousness as if they are your thoughts, create the impression that you are thinking and evaluating when actually you are being thought by programs installed by others. This colonization of internal space is most insidious form of control because it does not require external enforcement, does not require anyone to police your behavior, operates automatically through your own mind, punishing deviation and rewarding compliance. You become your own warden, your own critic, your own enforcer of norms and expectations that serve systems you may consciously oppose while unconsciously perpetuating through the internalized voices that control your internal world. The war requires distinguishing between your authentic values and judgments and the internalized voices of external authorities, requires recognizing when thought arising in your mind represents genuine reflection versus when it represents program running automatically, requires developing capacity to question and challenge and ultimately silence voices that do not serve your actual well-being or authentic development. This means psychological separation from authorities and systems that colonized your mind means developing your own values and standards rather than continuing to be controlled by programs they installed that continue running long after you have physically left their influence. You want something. The desire feels like yours. Natural, authentic. You call this preference. It is manufactured need. The third battleground is the desires and wants that feel completely authentic and natural, but that were actually implanted through exposure to advertising and media and cultural messaging designed specifically to create needs and dissatisfactions that did not exist before. These manufactured desires hijack your natural motivational systems, use your genuine need for meaning and connection and status to generate artificial wants that serve commercial and ideological interests rather than your actual well-being. You want products you did not know existed until advertising created awareness and desire. Want lifestyle you never considered until media presented it as necessary for happiness. Want body you were satisfied with until comparison to curated images generated dissatisfaction. Want success defined by metrics you never chose but that culture presented as only valid measures of worth. These wants feel completely genuine when they arise in consciousness, feel like natural expressions of who you are and what would satisfy you, but they are programs that have been deliberately installed to generate consumer behavior and conformity to social norms. The manufacturing operates through constant exposure that normalizes certain desires and delegitimizes others through creating associations between products or lifestyles and fundamental human needs for belonging and status and meaning, through generating anxiety and inadequacy that can supposedly be resolved through consumption or achievement or conformity. You do not consciously decide to want these things. The wanting arises automatically after sufficient exposure to messaging designed to create it, and then you experience the manufactured want as authentic desire emerging from your true self. The war requires distinguishing between genuine desires that arise from your actual nature and values and manufactured desires that were implanted through exposure to systems that profit from your wanting, requires recognizing that much of what you believe you want is actually what you have been programmed to want through deliberate manipulation of your motivational systems. This means questioning desires that feel completely natural, examining whether they serve your authentic well-being or whether they serve interests of systems that benefit from your consumption and conformity and perpetual dissatisfaction with what you have. You believe something strongly, unquestioningly. Defending it against doubt, you call this conviction. It is installed ideology. The fourth battleground is the beliefs and worldviews that feel like fundamental truths you have discovered through reason and experience, but that were actually absorbed through cultural immersion and social conditioning, beliefs you did not arrive at through careful examination, but that you adopted automatically from environment and authorities and now defend as if they were conclusions you reached independently. These installed beliefs operate as operating system for your mind, determining what you perceive as possible or impossible, right or wrong, true or false, before you even consciously evaluate any specific situation. You have political beliefs that feel like obvious truth, but that primarily reflect the politics of your family or community or social bubble, have religious or philosophical beliefs that feel like deep insights, but that mostly mirror beliefs of culture you were raised in, have assumptions about human nature and social organization and moral reality that feel like self-evident facts, but that would seem absurd or evil to people raised in different contexts. These beliefs do not feel like programming because they operate at such fundamental level that you use them to evaluate everything else rather than ever evaluating the beliefs themselves. The installation happens through repetition and authority and social reinforcement long before you developed capacity for critical evaluation, happens through presenting certain beliefs as unquestionable truth while presenting alternatives as obviously wrong or dangerous or not even worth considering. By the time you are adult capable of genuine independent thought, the programming is so deep and so automatic that questioning it feels like questioning reality itself rather than questioning one possible interpretation of reality. The war requires recognizing that most of your beliefs are not conclusions you reached, but are programs you absorbed, requires developing capacity to examine even your most fundamental assumptions and ask whether they serve your genuine understanding or whether they serve ideological systems that benefit from your believing certain things. This means tolerating the destabilization that comes from questioning beliefs that felt like bedrock truth, means accepting that much of what you believe with absolute certainty may be cultural programming rather than discovered wisdom, means being willing to reconstruct your entire worldview from ground up rather than continuing to operate according to operating system installed by others. An impulse arises, sudden, compelling, demanding immediate action. You call this desire. It is algorithmic manipulation. The fifth battleground is the impulses and urges that feel like natural, spontaneous desires, but that were actually triggered deliberately through algorithmic systems designed to hijack your attention and direct your behavior toward outcomes profitable for platforms and advertisers. These manufactured impulses operate through understanding of human psychology and exploitation of cognitive vulnerabilities through creating stimuli specifically engineered to generate compulsive responses that you experience as authentic wants arising from your own nature. The impulse to check your phone constantly, to scroll endlessly through feeds, to click on content designed to generate outrage or anxiety or envy, to compare yourself to curated lives that generate inadequacy, to purchase products that appear in algorithmically targeted ads. These impulses feel completely natural when they arise, feel like genuine desires you are choosing to act on, but they are responses to stimuli deliberately designed to generate exactly these responses through exploitation of your dopamine system and social comparison instincts and fear of missing out. The manipulation operates through creating association between the impulse and feeling of relief or reward or connection, through training your nervous system to crave the stimulation and to experience discomfort when deprived of it, through generating endless stream of triggers specifically calibrated to your individual vulnerabilities based on data harvested from your behavior. You are not choosing to have these impulses. They are being generated in you through systems that understand your psychology better than you understand it yourself, and that use that understanding to direct your attention and behavior toward their objectives. The war requires recognizing that impulses you experience as spontaneous, authentic desires are often manufactured responses to engineered stimuli, requires developing capacity to distinguish between genuine wants and triggered compulsions, requires understanding that you are battlefield inattention economy where sophisticated systems compete for control of your consciousness and behavior. This means reducing exposure to platforms designed to generate compulsive behavior, means developing awareness of triggers and impulses before acting on them automatically, means reclaiming sovereignty over your attention and impulses from systems that profit from your compulsive engagement. You react instantly, automatically, without conscious choice, to trigger you did not recognize. You call this emotion. It is conditioned response. The sixth battleground is the automatic emotional reactions that feel like natural, appropriate responses to situations, but that are actually conditioned patterns triggered by stimuli that may have no relationship to what is actually happening in present moment, reactions that reflect past trauma or conditioning rather than genuine response to current reality. These triggered reactions hijack your emotional system and generate states and behaviors that serve old patterns rather than serving your current well-being or authentic response to situation you are actually in. Someone says something that triggers shame or rage or anxiety, not because of what they actually said, but because their words activated pattern installed by earlier experiences, because your nervous system interpreted their statement through lens of past trauma and responded to the past rather than to present. You react with intensity completely disproportionate to actual situation, with emotional state that does not serve your interests or relationships, with behavior you later regret, but that felt completely justified and necessary in moment because the triggered reaction convinced you that you were responding to real threat or real injury when actually you were responding to ghost from past. The conditioning operates automatically and unconsciously, evaluating every situation for similarities to past experiences and triggering responses that were adaptive in original context, but that are harmful in current context, generating emotional states based on pattern matching rather than on accurate assessment of what is actually happening. You are not choosing these reactions, they are being generated by automatic systems that are trying to protect you from threats that no longer exist or that never existed in form the system believed they did. The war requires developing awareness of triggered reactions before they control behavior, requires learning to distinguish between genuine response to present moment and conditioned reaction to pattern from past, requires understanding that much of what you experience as justified emotion is actually automatic triggering that serves old patterns rather than current reality. This means slowing down between trigger and response, means learning your specific triggers and patterns, means developing capacity to choose response rather than being controlled by automatic reactions installed by past experiences. You must fight for your own mind every single day, against invasions you barely recognize. You call this overthinking. It is the only thinking that is actually yours. Winning the spiritual warfare for sovereignty over your own mind requires constant vigilance and continuous practice, requires developing capacity to observe your own thoughts and impulses and reactions, rather than identifying with them completely, requires distinguishing between mental content that represents your authentic self and mental content that represents programming and conditioning and manipulation. This is not one-time achievement, but is daily practice of reclaiming mental territory from occupying forces that are constantly attempting to colonize your consciousness. The practice involves creating space between thought and identification with thought, between impulse and action on impulse, between triggered reaction and behavioral expression of reaction. This space allows you to observe mental content arising without immediately accepting it as yours, allows you to question where thoughts and desires and reactions are coming from and whether they serve your authentic well-being or whether they serve programs and systems that have colonized your mind. This requires meditation or contemplative practice that develops observer consciousness, requires learning to watch thoughts arise and pass without grabbing onto them or pushing them away, requires developing capacity to be present with your mind without being completely controlled by its content. It requires critical examination of beliefs you have never questioned, requires interrogating desires that feel completely natural, requires recognizing patterns of automatic reaction that happen before conscious awareness. The war also requires reducing exposure to systems designed to colonize your consciousness, limiting time on platforms that generate compulsive behavior, reducing consumption of advertising and media that implant desires and dissatisfactions, creating space from cultural messaging that normalizes certain values and delegitimizes others. You cannot win this war while remaining constantly exposed to forces attempting to occupy your mind, while allowing unlimited access to consciousness by systems that profit from controlling your attention and behavior. Most importantly, the war requires accepting that your thoughts are not always yours, that much of what arises in consciousness is invasion rather than authentic self-expression, that reclaiming sovereignty over your own mind is lifelong practice rather than destination you reach. The forces attempting to control your consciousness are sophisticated and persistent and constantly evolving, and maintaining freedom requires constant practice of distinguishing between what is genuinely yours and what has been installed by others. This is the spiritual warfare, not metaphysical, psychological. The battle for sovereignty over your own mind. The warfare in daily life is not between angels and demons, but between authentic self and colonizing forces that have invaded your consciousness, between genuine thoughts and thoughts that have been implanted, between authentic desires and manufactured wants, between chosen values and absorbed programming, between genuine responses and triggered reactions. You are battlefield where cultural conditioning and algorithmic manipulation and trauma patterns and ego defenses and consumerist messaging and ideological programming compete for control of your attention and behavior and ultimately your life. Most people lose this war without recognizing they are fighting it because they identify completely with all mental content, experience every thought and desire and reaction as authentically theirs, never question whether the voice in their head is actually their voice or is occupation force that has colonized their consciousness so completely that they cannot distinguish between self and programming. They spend their entire lives being thought by programs rather than thinking their own thoughts, being controlled by implanted desires rather than pursuing authentic wants, being triggered by patterns rather than choosing responses, being directed by systems rather than directing their own lives. Winning the war requires recognizing that it is happening, that your mind is contested territory, that much of what you experience as your thoughts and desires and reactions is actually invasion that must be identified and questioned and ultimately expelled to create space for authentic self to emerge and speak and direct your life. This means daily practice of observing mental content without identifying with it, of questioning thoughts and desires and reactions before accepting them as yours, of creating space between stimulus and response where genuine choice becomes possible. The war is difficult because the occupying forces are sophisticated and because you have spent your life believing they were you, because distinguishing between authentic self and programming requires psychological work most people never do, because maintaining sovereignty requires constant vigilance against constant invasion. But the alternative is spending your entire life as occupied territory, being controlled by forces you never recognized as foreign, never discovering what your own thoughts and desires and values actually are beneath all the programming.